The golden hues of the Sacramento sunset stretched across the sky, bathing the city in a fleeting warmth before nightfall. The streets, still pulsing with rush-hour energy, felt alive yet indifferent, just another evening in California's capital. Jonathan Ellis adjusted the air conditioning in his black Lincoln sedan, sighing as the cool air rolled over his face. It had been a long day, and at 65, long days weighed heavier than they used to. The low hum of jazz played through his speakers, a familiar tune he couldn't quite name, but one that settled the nerves. His fingers tapped idly on the leather steering wheel as he approached an intersection. The traffic light flickered yellow. He eased his foot onto the brake, coasting to a stop just as the red shone bright. Then, flashing red and blue lights. A siren blared behind him, cutting through the mellow jazz like a knife. Jonathan's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. A Sacramento PD cruiser loomed close, its headlights drilling into his back window. He exhaled sharply. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath. Pulling to the curb, he moved with deliberate care, turning off the engine, lowering his window, and keeping both hands in plain sight. The officer took his time exiting the car. Jonathan watched in the mirror as a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut approached, his posture radiating control. "License and registration," the officer said curtly, his voice clipped, businesslike. Jonathan nodded. "Of course, officer." His movements were slow, deliberate, respectful, but his mind was already working. Something about this didn't feel routine. Jonathan reached into the glove compartment, his movements measured, careful. Even at his age, 65 years of living, decades of law enforcement experience, he knew better than to make any sudden moves. The officer stood rigidly outside the driver's side window, his right hand resting near his holster, his eyes locked onto Jonathan's every motion. Jonathan handed over his license and registration. "Here you go, officer." His voice was even calm. The officer barely glanced at the documents before flicking his gaze back to Jonathan. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Jonathan considered his response. A younger man might have answered with frustration, maybe even defiance. But Jonathan knew the game. He'd seen it play out too many times before. "Not entirely sure," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. The officer, Deputy Mark Calloway, according to the name on his badge, tilted his head slightly. "You didn't come to a full stop at that light." Jonathan frowned. "I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Calloway didn't respond right away. Instead, he lingered, eyes narrowing as if searching for something. The air between them thickened, no longer just a simple exchange between a driver and an officer. "You from around here?" Calloway asked, flipping Jonathan's license over in his fingers. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "Moved here a few months ago. Address is right there." But Calloway wasn't really listening. His gaze was assessing, weighing something unspoken. The shift was subtle, but Jonathan had felt it before, a simple stop morphing into something more. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Calloway pressed. Jonathan met his gaze. "Just going home." A pause. The officer's jaw tensed slightly. "Step out of the car for me." Jonathan's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, but his face betrayed nothing. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" His voice was still calm, but now there was an edge to it, one that didn't go unnoticed. Calloway's lips twitched, but he masked it quickly. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." There it was, the shift from procedure to power play. Jonathan exhaled slowly, then pushed open the door and stepped onto the pavement. He was taller than Calloway had expected. Broader, too. His gray-streaked hair and tailored suit spoke of a man accustomed to authority, not submission. Calloway took half a step back before catching himself. "Hands where I can see them." Jonathan complied, moving with calculated ease. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Calloway smirked faintly. "Just routine. Had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Jonathan turned his head slightly. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The words landed like a punch. Calloway's composure faltered, just for a moment. He straightened up, his hand shifting toward his belt, A reflex more than necessity. Watch your tone. Jonathan tilted his head, studying the man. I'm simply asking a question, officer. Transparency, you know. Calloway scoffed but didn't answer right away. He took a slow, pacing step, eyes flicking back toward the sedan, as if searching for justification he hadn't yet manufactured. Then, without warning, turn around and place your hands on the hood. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Weapons, he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief but still measured. Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon? Calloway's jaw tightened. I'm not going to ask you again. A younger man might have protested. A less experienced one might have complied in anger. But Jonathan? He knew control wasn't about force, it was about presence. So he exhaled, turned slowly, and placed his palms flat on the hood of his car. The officer moved in, patting him down with quick, rough movements. His hands lingered longer than necessary. It wasn't just a search, it was a test. A provocation. Jonathan didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't react. And that bothered Calloway more than anything. You're clean, the officer muttered, stepping back. But his voice lacked the satisfaction he'd been hoping for. Jonathan turned to face him, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp. Of course I am. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Calloway was starting to realize this wasn't going to play out the way he'd expected. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. And the real test was about to begin. Jonathan adjusted his stance, rolling his shoulders slightly as he turned back to face Calloway. The officer was still standing close, too close, his hand near his belt, his posture stiff with unresolved tension. He didn't like how this was unfolding. Jonathan could see it, the irritation, the frustration, the way Calloway's jaw clenched just a little tighter with every passing second. This was supposed to be easy. A routine stop, a show of authority, and then the driver would be on his way, rattled but compliant. But Jonathan wasn't rattled, and Calloway didn't know what to do with that. Calloway let out a breath, tapping his fingers against the top of his holster. You seem awfully confident, he muttered. Like you think you know what's going to happen next. Jonathan met his gaze evenly. Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is. Calloway's expression darkened. Watch yourself, he warned, voice dropping into something lower, something meant to intimidate. Jonathan held his ground. I'm just making an observation. This stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago, didn't it? Calloway took half a step forward, eyes narrowing. You got something to hide? Jonathan let a pause stretch just a second too long. Just enough to make Calloway wonder. Then he smiled. Just barely. No, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it. That did it. Calloway's composure cracked, just slightly. His lip curled, and for the first time, his irritation turned into something sharper. Something personal. Fairness? Calloway repeated, a hint of disbelief lacing the word. You think fairness is what this is about? Jonathan said nothing, just watched him. Studied him. He didn't need to speak. The silence did the work for him. Calloway's hand hovered a little too long near his belt before he caught himself. He exhaled sharply, glancing toward Jonathan's car as if looking for a reason. Any reason to keep this going. Then, the words slipped out before he could stop them. People like you always. He stopped. Abruptly. But it was too late. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. But the shift in his posture, the way his shoulders squared just slightly, that spoke volumes. People like me? Jonathan repeated, his voice soft, but charged with meaning. Calloway's face tensed, his own words echoing back at him, hanging in the air like smoke. He tried to recover. You know what I mean? Jonathan nodded slowly. I think I do. Another silence. This one heavier than the last. Jonathan could see it happening, Calloway realizing piece by piece just how badly this had gone for him. The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. His certainty, his authority, the unshakable confidence he carried when he first stepped out of that cruiser, it was all slipping away. Jonathan let the moment settle before speaking again, his voice steady and deliberate. Officer, I think it's time you know who I am. Calloway blinked, his scowl faltering. I don't care who you are, he shot back too quickly. Jonathan reached into his pocket, slow and deliberate. I'm reaching for my badge, he said calmly, watching as Calloway stiffened, his hand twitching slightly near his holster. No need for theatrics. I want you to see it. Calloway's eyes followed the movement. Jonathan flipped open a small leather wallet, revealing a gleaming badge beneath the streetlights. Jonathan Ellis, he said, his tone as casual as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. Then he let the words settle in. Head of Internal Affairs. Sacramento PD. Calloway's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. His eyes flicked to the badge, then back to Jonathan's face, searching for something, anything, that would make this a joke. But there was no humor in Jonathan's expression. Only quiet authority, and a hint of disappointment. Calloway's breath hitched. He took a step back. Jonathan tilted his head. Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Calloway? Calloway didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd stepped into quicksand. Jonathan took a slow step forward, closing the gap Calloway had instinctively created. It's not the profiling, he said, voice calm but piercing. Though that's bad enough. It's not even the baseless escalation. Calloway's lips parted, but Jonathan didn't let him speak. It's that you did all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. Silence. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights. You assumed I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why? Calloway swallowed hard, but no words came. Jonathan's gaze bore into him. Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect. He let the weight of that settle. Let Calloway feel it. And that's not just a problem for me, officer, Jonathan continued, voice unwavering. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform. Calloway looked down at the badge again, as if hoping it might vanish if he didn't look too closely. His shoulders sagged just slightly, his confidence unraveling in real time. Jonathan stepped back, giving him room to breathe. But his voice remained firm. Here's what's going to happen. Calloway's gaze snapped up. You're going to return my documents. You're going to take a step back, and you're going to think very carefully about what you say next. Calloway hesitated, and then Jonathan added, his voice lowering just slightly, because you'll be hearing from me again. Not as a driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man who decides whether you're fit to wear that badge. Calloway's face reddened. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his chest pocket, pulled out Jonathan's license and registration, and handed them over without a word. Jonathan took them, tucking them back into his wallet. He stepped toward his car, placing a hand on the driver's side door. Then he paused, looked over his shoulder one last time. Remember this, Officer Calloway. The officer barely met his gaze. The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone. Jonathan slid into his car, started the engine, and pulled away, leaving Calloway standing in the fading light, his confidence shattered, and his future uncertain. Jonathan drove in silence, the hum of his Lincoln's engine the only sound in the cabin. The city lights blurred past him, but his mind was sharp, replaying every second of that unnecessary stop. Not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. He'd seen men like Calloway before, officers who wielded authority like a weapon rather than a duty. But this time was different. This time, Calloway had stopped the wrong man. And now, there would be consequences. Jonathan walked into the Internal Affairs office, coffee in one hand, a file in the other. The early morning sun cast long shadows across his desk as he settled into his chair. A sharp knock at the door. His assistant, Linda, stepped in, a small stack of reports in her hands. Morning, Mr. Ellis. I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Hughes wanted me to remind you about the department review next week. Jonathan nodded, taking the files from her. Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with the chief this afternoon? Something's come up. She hesitated, sensing the weight in his voice. Of course. As she left, Jonathan opened the thin manila folder on his desk, Officer Mark Calloway. It didn't take long to find what he already suspected. Minor complaints. Unprofessional conduct. A pattern of excessive stops. Nothing egregious enough to raise alarms, but enough to paint a clear picture. Calloway wasn't an outlier. He was a symptom. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in thought. This wasn't just about Calloway. This was about the system that let men like him operate unchecked. That afternoon, Jonathan sat across from Chief Warren Hughes, the head of the Sacramento PD. Hughes, a grizzled veteran in his late 60s, was a man who'd seen it all, from riots to reforms, from corruption to commendations. But even men like Hughes had their blind spots. Hughes leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This isn't the first time Calloway's name has come up, he admitted. But we've always handled it internally. Jonathan's lips pressed into a firm line. And that's the problem, Chief. Hughes sighed. Look, I get it. You had a bad run-in with him. But, Jonathan held up a hand. This isn't about me. This is about the department. This is about what happens when we let men like Calloway believe their badge puts them above the law, instead of binding them to it. The room fell silent. Hughes studied him carefully. So what are you proposing? Jonathan didn't hesitate. A department-wide review. Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We need to stop handling these things quietly and start dealing with them loudly. Hughes let out a long breath. You know this is going to ruffle some feathers. Jonathan's expression didn't waver. Good. It's about time someone did. The chief sighed again, but there was a grudging respect in his gaze. I'll set the wheels in motion, but you'd better be ready for the fallout. Jonathan gave a small nod. I always am. Within days, the wheels were turning. Internal affairs began pulling records, scheduling interviews, reviewing cases that had never been properly addressed. Calloway, for his part, was called in for an internal hearing. Jonathan made no secret of his presence, sitting across the table from Calloway as the officer squirmed under the scrutiny. It didn't take long for the verdict, suspension. But Jonathan knew suspending Calloway wasn't the real victory. The real victory was making sure there wouldn't be another Calloway in his place. Weeks later, Jonathan stood at the podium of a community meeting, facing a room filled with officers, city officials, and Sacramento residents. He cleared his throat, his voice steady as it carried through the hall. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about ensuring the people sworn to protect and serve do so with fairness and integrity. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some were skeptical, some were hopeful, but they were listening. And that, Jonathan knew, was the beginning of real change. The air inside the hearing room was thick with tension. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, the only sound in the otherwise silent chamber. Jonathan sat at the far end of the long, polished table, his fingers laced together as he watched Officer Mark Calloway shift uncomfortably in his seat. The officer's usual arrogance had been stripped away, replaced with something else, uncertainty. Across from him sat a panel of senior officers and department officials, their expressions grim. The Internal Affairs Review had brought more than just Calloway's actions to light. Patterns had emerged. Complaints that had once been dismissed as misunderstandings now formed a disturbing picture of unchecked misconduct. Calloway cleared his throat. I didn't mean for the stop to go that far. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. That far? His voice was calm, but the edge was unmistakable. Tell me, officer, where exactly was that far? Calloway hesitated. I was just doing my job. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. Your job? He let the words settle, then shook his head. Your job is to uphold the law, not manipulate it. Your job is to protect, not profile. Your job is to serve, not to intimidate. Calloway's jaw clenched. I never. Jonathan held up a hand. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights. You assumed I wouldn't question you. And most importantly, you assumed there wouldn't be consequences. Silence. Calloway looked away, his knuckles white against the table. Jonathan sat back. Officer Calloway, I don't take pleasure in seeing you here. But let me be clear, this isn't about you. This is about what happens when we fail to hold each other accountable. The panel exchanged looks. The room was waiting, expectant. Chief Warren Hughes cleared his throat, shifting his weight in his chair. Officer Calloway, due to the findings of this review, you are hereby suspended, effective immediately. A muscle twitched in Calloway's jaw. He nodded stiffly but said nothing. Jonathan didn't move, didn't gloat. This wasn't about punishing one man. It was about sending a message. And the message had been received. In the days that followed, the department was abuzz. Officers whispered in hallways, speculating about who might be next under review. Some welcomed the changes. Others resented them. Jonathan knew this wasn't over. Real change never came easy. A week later, he sat in his office when Linda walked in, a small stack of letters in her hands. "More complaints coming in," she said, placing them on his desk. "People are talking, Jonathan. The community is watching." Jonathan picked up the first envelope, running his fingers over the seal. He exhaled. "Good. Let them." That Friday, Jonathan found himself standing before a packed community hall, the energy in the room electric. He looked out at the crowd, officers, city officials, local activists, concerned citizens. Some faces were skeptical, arms crossed, waiting for a reason to dismiss him. Others were hopeful, eyes filled with something that looked dangerously close to belief. Jonathan adjusted the microphone. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," he began. "It's about ensuring that those who wear the badge do so with integrity, with fairness, with respect." A murmur rippled through the audience. "For too long, we've handled problems quietly behind closed doors. That ends now." More murmurs. Some approving, some wary. "This isn't about politics. This isn't about good cops versus bad cops. This is about accountability. Because if we don't hold ourselves to the highest standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Jonathan's voice softened, but his conviction never wavered. "This isn't just my responsibility. It's all of ours. Every officer, every official, every citizen. We decide what kind of department we want, what kind of city we want, what kind of country we want." The room was silent now, listening. Jonathan let the moment breathe before delivering his final words. "Change won't come overnight. But it will come. And it starts with us." The applause this time was thunderous. Jonathan stepped back, his heart steady. This was just the beginning. The night after the community meeting, Jonathan sat alone in his office, the city skyline glowing through his window. A half-empty cup of coffee sat beside a growing stack of files, internal reports, officer evaluations, formal complaints that had once been dismissed as misunderstandings. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of it all. The review had only just begun, but the resistance was already brewing. A knock at the door. Linda stepped in, her expression unreadable. "Chief Hughes is here." Jonathan sighed, straightened his tie, and nodded. "Send him in." The door opened wider, and Chief Warren Hughes strode in, his hands in his pockets. His face, lined with decades of service, looked more tired than usual. He closed the door behind him, then took a seat across from Jonathan without waiting for an invitation. "Well," Hughes exhaled, rubbing his chin. "You sure know how to stir up a hornet's nest." Jonathan smirked faintly. "That's the job." Hughes leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Some of the senior brass aren't happy, you know. They think this review is bad for morale." Jonathan nodded slowly, as if considering it. Then he met Hughes' eyes. "Morale for who?" Hughes hesitated. Jonathan didn't let him off the hook. "Because I'll tell you who it's been bad for. The people pulled over for no reason. The ones whose complaints got buried. The ones who had to teach their kids how to survive an encounter with one of our officers." Hughes exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You're not wrong, but damn it, Jonathan, this isn't going to be easy." Jonathan let out a dry chuckle. "Easy? Warren, if this was easy, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Hughes ran a hand over his face. "You're asking me to change the culture of an entire department." Jonathan's voice was steady. "I'm asking you to fix what's broken." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Hughes nodded. "All right. Let's do it." Jonathan leaned back in his chair. "Good." In the weeks that followed, the department review wasn't just a process, it was a battle. Some officers cooperated, welcoming change. Others resisted, complaining about oversight gone too far. Anonymous letters arrived, some from officers who had witnessed misconduct but were afraid to speak up. Others were from those furious at Jonathan for exposing their own. The local news picked up the story. Sacramento PD faces reckoning. Internal Affairs launches historic review. Jonathan read the headlines without flinching. The truth needed to be told. Then came the threats. One morning, Linda entered his office, her face pale. She placed a typed note on his desk. Jonathan picked it up. That was it. 2 words, typed in bold and signed. He looked up at Linda. This come through the mail? She nodded, her voice tight. No return address. Jonathan sighed, shaking his head. Cowards. Linda hesitated. Do you want me to report it? He studied the note for another moment before setting it aside. No. Whoever sent this already knows I won't. Because Jonathan Ellis didn't back down. And they knew it. Months later, Jonathan once again found himself at a podium, but this time it was different. The review had been completed. Dozens of complaints had been investigated. Training protocols had been revised. Officers with repeated violations were either disciplined or dismissed. The department had changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully, and the community noticed. Jonathan looked out at the crowd gathered before him. Officers, citizens, city officials, reporters. He took a breath and spoke. This wasn't about punishing individuals. This was about holding ourselves to the standard we swore to uphold. The badge is not a shield from accountability. It is a promise to serve, not just some of the people, but all of them. The room was silent. Listening, Jonathan let his gaze sweep over the audience. Some skeptical, some hopeful, but all of them watching. Change didn't come overnight, but it had come, and for now that was enough. As Jonathan stepped away from the podium, the applause still echoing in the hall, a familiar voice called out, Mr. Ellis. He turned to see a young man approaching, early 20s, wearing a worn denim jacket and an expression torn between gratitude and frustration. My name's Aaron, the young man said, his voice steady but laced with something deeper. I just wanted to say, I've been stopped 3 times this year. For nothing. Just for being in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. Jonathan nodded, his gaze steady. I know. Aaron let out a bitter chuckle. Do you? Because I hear a lot of talk about change, but out there? He gestured toward the city beyond the glass doors. It still feels the same. Jonathan studied him for a long moment. I won't lie to you. This isn't going to be fixed overnight. But if we stop pushing, stop holding them accountable, then nothing changes at all. Aaron hesitated. And if they don't listen? Jonathan's voice was firm. Then we get louder. The young man exhaled, nodding slowly. All right. Let's see if they're really listening. Jonathan extended a hand. Aaron shook it. As he walked away, Jonathan turned to the cameras, his final message clear. If this story resonated with you, share it. Change starts with those willing to speak up. Jonathan Ellis knew one simple truth. Power without accountability is a danger to everyone. His encounter with Officer Calloway was not unique. It was a symptom of a system that had allowed unchecked authority to become the norm. But Jonathan also knew something else. Change doesn't happen in silence. Too often, people choose to look away, to accept that this is just how things are. But that night on the side of the road, Jonathan made a choice. He didn't get angry. He didn't get reckless. He got to work. And that's the lesson. Real change isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. It's about demanding better from those in power and holding them to the standards they swore to uphold. When people like Calloway believe they can act without consequence, injustice thrives. But when people like Jonathan refuse to stay silent, justice has a chance to win. The badge isn't a shield from accountability. It is a promise, a duty. And when that duty is broken, it must be called out, not with whispers, but with a voice strong enough to be heard. Because silence never changed anything. But standing up, that changes everything. What would you have done in Jonathan's shoes? Do you think real change starts with one person taking a stand, or does it take an entire community? Let's start the conversation. Like, comment, and share your thoughts below. And if you want more powerful stories that challenge, inspire, and push for change, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Your voice matters. Let's make it heard.